I was reading some Ernest Holmes this week, and I ran across something that I wasn't really aware of in his work. And this spoke to me so deeply. He said, when the soul does not remember itself, there is a vitality in our communion with infinite love. Wow. In the work that I do as a minister, but also in my day job in working in the addiction field, there is something that is a bedrock truth that I can identify with. When I wake up in the morning, I don't care what kind of mood I'm in, I know this. And that is something that Holmes said also, there's nothing to heal, only to reveal. And I encounter people in my life, and I can relate to this myself when it's like, I'm lost. I don't know. I don't know if this thing called God or Spirit exists, and I'm cut off from it, and I need to build some bridge to it, And and maybe there's a tendency to think, well, I'm a bad person. I'm not redeemable, or I've succumbed to something that is really dragging me down. And so we start to confuse that with our identity. It becomes a belief system we have about ourselves. And that belief system isn't true. You're God. You're not God, but you're God. God is there. Nothing takes that away. Eternally. And so I work with people who sometimes I have a conversation with, and they'll tell me every reason in the world why they're all completely screwed up. And what I mean by that is it's like, I'm the broken toy, There's something wrong with me. And they rattle off all that stuff to make their case. You know how we make our case sometimes. And I love the fact that I can sit there and listen and listen and listen and listen. And finally, when they talk themselves out, I'll say, I don't believe that. What? I got the rap sheet, dude. I don't believe the rap sheet. I don't believe all this stuff you're saying, because what I know is that there is a truth about you. You are a beloved child of Spirit. And you may have lost your way a little bit, because Holmes said, when the soul does not remember. What's the philosophy that we teach in this place? It's very simply this. We must remember who we are. Because when we remember who we are great. We are amazing. And I think that what I love about this philosophy is this idea that somehow it's about not becoming somebody else, but tuning our vision, tuning our hearing to the idea of who and what we truly are. Because if we do that, somehow it is reflected back to us all the time. And so I want to share something with you that I found in a book called Zen Flesh and Zen Bones. And if you indulge me for just a moment, it's a very short piece. I want to read it to you. One of the Buddha's most renowned and devoted disciples, sitting for most of a spring day in meditation under a cherry tree, when flowers began to fall about him, the gods whispered, "We are praising you for your dedicated devotion to the work of spiritual light. But I have not spoken of spiritual light. You have not spoken of spiritual light, and we have not heard you speak of spiritual light. That is true spiritual light." And blossoms showered upon him as rain. That's beautiful. Imagine that. Who am I, God? Am I loved? and the cherry blossoms come down as rain. Brian Brown Walker, a spiritual writer, said, holding together through communion denotes an intentional creation of union. The first requirement for holding together is that we hold our own inner truth, that we adhere to principles as a matter of habit. See, what he's speaking there of is devotion. Why was the meditative teacher showered with cherry blossoms? Because he had spent the day in meditation. And does that mean we have to spend our whole day in meditation? No. It denotes this idea of devotion, spiritual devotion, to be devoted. That's a really old-fashioned word, devotion. Communion, commitment. Today we're talking about the renewal of love. And I believe that, if you talk to the marriage counseling world, for example, the relationship counseling world, and what they'll tell you is that, love isn't something that we need to patch up once in a while or give somebody some chocolate once or twice a year. It's about a renewal that happens every day. It's about being present. See, when I read this story about the cherry blossoms, I think to myself, okay, we got God, we got the gods, it says the gods, and we got the meditator. We know the roles they play. But I want to ask the question, what's the role of the cherry tree? I think that's really interesting. Because isn't it true that having our goodness reflected to us, it's great when a cherry tree does it, but what about other people? And we have this Martin Luther King quote. What's he talking about? He's talking about coming together. He's talking about reflecting it to each other. I had an aunt. She was one of my mom's sisters. My mom had 3 sisters, and these wonderful 4 women, my mom and her 3 sisters. And then there was my grandmother. These women, these wonderful women that I grew up around. And my mom's oldest sister, my aunt, she's an interesting lady. She was born sometime in the late 20s. She actually graduated college. My grandparents during the Depression, were migrant farm workers down around the San Jose area. My mom said that she cut her front teeth on a prune bucket because the whole family would go out and pick, and my grandfather worked with farm machinery, and my mom was a little kid. She worked in the packing sheds down there. And they lived in farming, what they called farm worker housing, which some people called tar paper shacks. But if you said that in my family, you'd get things thrown at you because they didn't like that. So my oldest aunt, she actually graduated from college. And she never got married her whole life. And after graduating from college, she went off to Kenya in Africa to work in establishing schools and teaching and those kinds of things. Somewhere in college, she got turned on to this, and off she went. And she ended up over in Africa in the late 40s, and she was there off and on until the early 70s. She would be gone like for 5 or 6 years at a time, then she'd come back for a year. I loved it when she came back because she was like an aunt who was like Sean Connery or something. She was like Indiana Jones. She was a little tiny lady, bow-legged. When she was a little kid, the nutrition was so bad she had rickets and she had bow legs and stuff. But she could fix anything. She could build models. She was great. She was one of the toughest men I ever knew. But she had that real feminine, caring quality. Okay, so she ends up going to Africa in the late 40s. She graduates from college. Now, let's imagine the society at that time. Can you imagine what she was up against? And also in her own family, because my grandfather struggled with a daughter who did all this. But my grandmother loved her. That's my little girl. My grandmother struggled with childbirth. She had 5 children altogether, 1 boy and 4 girls. And she lost a few children at birth, and she miscarried a number. And every time she went through that, my Aunt Pearl, that was her name, oldest aunt, because my mom passed away when I was in my early 20s. And so Pearl, she would tell me a lot about the family history. And she said when Mom had birthing problems, she would end up in bed for a month, and a few times they almost lost her, And my Aunt Pearl talked about being on a couple of farms when she described a couple of the little girls who didn't make it. And in those days, the doctor would be there, and my grandfather would take the little girl that didn't make it, and he would give it to Pearl and say, here's a sleeping gown, wash her up, and I'm going to go build the coffin. He would go to the wood shop of the farm, nail a coffin together, and because she would be buried in an orchard or something, he would write her name with a carpenter's pencil on top. And Pearl and my grandfather, sometimes they couldn't get a minister out there. They would stand there and they would pray. So Pearl and my grandmother became very close. This woman who would live such an extraordinary life for her time, and she was just so close. And so when all of society and parts of the family and her own father struggled with Pearl's life, my grandmother simply loved her. Now, a lot of you in this room aren't going to remember this. This goes way back. So it used to be when people lived in other countries, there's what they called an airmail form, and they were blue. And you would go to the post office and buy these. They were a single piece. So you'd write your letter, fold it up. It was its own envelope, and you would mail it. It was this real light blue. And it was exciting when we would get a light blue letter in the mail because we knew it was her. And my mom would get one every month or two, or maybe longer, depending upon what was going on. Because Pearl, at different times, had black water fever. She had malaria. She was chased out of her home by army ants one time. Couldn't go back inside for about 3 weeks. She was there during the Mau Mau uprising. She was almost taken hostage one time. But some guy who had been in a school and a student in one of her schools recognized her. Her name was Pearl Heath, and all of a sudden, she tells this story. She said she was out in the middle of nowhere. All of a sudden, the road is covered with people. And what they would do is they would put flashlights under their faces, which was really scary in the middle of Africa, in the middle of nowhere. And so she would stop her truck. They would walk up, and this one time, because she was a white woman, white person, is like, get out of the truck, whatever, 4-letter words. And someone said, Miss Heath, is that you? I said, yeah, it's me. Yeah, it's me. Okay, let her go, because she had taught some kid. And so sometimes writing letters was kind of tough, But she and my grandmother exchanged letters basically on a weekly basis. But sometimes, because back in those days, it was real mail. I mean, sometimes 5 would show up at once, and I'm sure it was that way on the other end too, My grandmother and Pearl had an ongoing weekly correspondence until my grandmother died in around 1969 or 1970, every week. These letters were, and they both talked about what they were doing. They both talked about how they were feeling. And they both would reach out and want to know how the other was doing. My beloved mother, my beloved daughter. There is an archetype in spirituality of the feminine parent that is so beautiful. The feminine parent, so devoted. In studying metaphysics, I love that part of metaphysics because growing up in another religion, we heard more of the stern, patriarchal, warrior, thing. It's the presence and the nurturing of the feminine parent. When I was training in ministry, and also as I received an education as a counselor, I was advised by a couple of women in my life who I consider my precious teachers and mentors, and they said, "Andy, you need to feminine up a little bit." Look at me. You know what I'm saying? I'm not a pinup girl, And it was about presence. It was about nurturing. It was about, I don't care what you're going through. I'm going to be with you. You see, the other thing about the story from the Zen story is we don't know why the dude was under there for half a day meditating. Maybe that wasn't a good day. Maybe he was going through some stuff. Maybe his soul had forgotten who it was. And the lotus flowers, cherry flowers begin to drop. The presence of that tree wasn't going anywhere. Those flowers weren't going anywhere. We love you. This is who you are. You're completely lovable. Pearl was in Kenya when her mother passed away, my grandmother. And back in those days, because she tended to travel back and forth to Africa on freighters because it was cheap, airline travel. There was airline travel then, but it was really expensive. She was never a rich woman. She did her thing, right? She had some good freighter stories. Some of those guys were like pirates, you know what I'm saying? And these freighters would rent out half dozen staterooms to people who wanted to travel with them, go through the Suez Canal and all that stuff. When Pearl passed away, in all of her possessions in this little tiny apartment she lived in, and we went through her stuff, we found that my mom had sent her a recording of my grandmother's funeral on a reel, brown tape. So we're going through all this stuff, and all of a sudden there's this little square box in there. We pulled this up, and on the box was written, Mother's Memorial. My mom's name was Evelyn. Love Evelyn. And she kept that all those years. And, I think that one of the greatest spiritual kinds of ideas that we can inhabit is to imagine ourselves as the ambassadors of spirit. So we have this great teaching, right? Spirit is love. We are all deserving of love. So why don't we become the hands and the feet and the voice of spirit? Why don't we become the presence of spirit? So what do I really mean by this as I finish up here today? I have a very dear friend of mine who I work with and have a great deal of respect for. I have a great deal of affection for this person because we work and the type of work we do, you go through a lot. And he is politically completely opposite of what I am politically. And so I try really hard to avoid that, and he tries to avoid it, but sometimes it comes up. And so when it comes up, What I've decided to do in order to be present with him and to let him know how much I care about him is I know that his political ideas of how we fix things is something I don't agree with. But what can I agree with? His concerns, his worries. My life, where's the country going? What's going on around me? Are my children going to have a future? I can show up in that. Yeah, I hear you, man. You know? And knowing that we are on different sides, I can say, I know, because this is metaphysical. I know that we will all figure this out. I know that about us. And we may disagree about that, but somehow when we come together, we're all going to figure that out. That's my grandmother. That's the cherry tree. That's the blossoms. That's showing up for this idea of, your soul is hurting. Your soul is forgetting who it is. But I'll remember that. I can do that for you. I can show up in that way. Because you're part of me and I'm part of you. That's what people like King were trying to say. So I want to finish up today with Charles Fillmore, who was a co-founder of Unity. He says, communion is sharing the deep aspirations of one's heart with the indwelling presence of Spirit in its still small voice. How can we be Spirit's small voice? That's our challenge. Thank you so much, guys. I really appreciate it. So, namaste. All right. All right.